feel like so torqued up to say, and we're live.
And we're live.
You guys do this every day.
Yeah, well, Ben does. I do it a couple times a week, or I don't know.
Go for it, Scott. And we're live. You can do it.
And we're live. No, that wasn't good. And we're live. It is Sunday, May 30th, 2021, 5:03 p.m. Mystery guest Sunday. Kate is on a plane right now, flying back from Iceland, and the
boy,
reason
are her arms tired.
Yeah. See, Taisu wanted to know if he had to prep for the show, and so I was definitely not. Definitely not. So the reason why Kate is not here, we didn't talk about this yesterday, actually. So in order to come back from Iceland, you need a PCR COVID test within 72 hours, which he discovered at the airport, and then spent a good part of yesterday traveling around Iceland trying to find a COVID test. That will be, I imagine that will be her monologue. But I don't have a monologue, Ben. Do you have?
I don't have a monologue today, so why don't you introduce the mystery guest?
Okay, I will. We can't have fun anymore, but we can have Taisu Zhang. Taisu is my colleague at Yale, at the Yale Law School. He is an expert on comparative law with a particular focus on Chinese law and the history of Chinese law. But also he's an incredibly astute observer of Chinese politics, Chinese society, and why, despite everything, America is still better. You should know Taisu is like a big America first person. He's a big booster. Now, one of the things I really want to talk to you about, I want to talk to you about like lots of things involving China, but one of the things I first want to talk to you about is like, in what, I don't speak or read Chinese, and I'm not on Chinese social media, like, and I know you are. So I guess one of the questions I have is, aside from things like there are certain things you're not allowed to talk about, blah blah blah, or things that get censored, in what way would you compare the two, the Chinese social media, is it rowdier? Is it less rowdy? Is it more? I mean, do you have a kind of a sense of like what the differences are?
It's a very good question. I would say so. Twitter, like my main comparison is between Twitter and the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, which is called Weibo. I have a much larger following on Weibo than I do on Twitter because I've been using it for much longer, and of course, like I'm probably better known in China than I am in the U.S. That skews things a little bit. The sense is just leaving aside the censorship and the things you can't talk about, and the various kinds of innuendo and code language you employ to get around those things. I'd say that, well, I mean, the big difference is that Chinese Twitter is just Chinese, right? So it's basically virtually no one outside of China uses Weibo. Whereas Twitter, if I get shit on Twitter, it's going to be from people from all kinds of different nationalities and backgrounds. Like, one of the major times I got myself into trouble a couple months ago was when I posted something negative about Modi. And there were a bunch of Hindu nationalists who just came out of nowhere to flood my Twitter feed for a couple of days. So that kind of experience happens on Twitter. You get an international crowd. There are more minefields that you have to navigate, but also more possibilities to get exposed to things that you don't know. Chinese Weibo was, compared to that, less interesting. less diverse.
Is there like, so the joke is on Twitter is that every oh the joke on Twitter is that I got feedback here.
Yeah.
Well, the joke on Twitter is that like every day there's a main character, and the goal is not to be that character. You know, like the person who gets dragged like the entire day, and then you move on to the next person the next day. Does it have that quality to it?
Of course it does. So the thing is, the censorship has all kinds of spillover effects. So, like, how to be the person of the day is quite a bit different between China and Chinese Twitter and Twitter. Chinese Twitter is a lot less intellectual, simply because you can't say most things on Chinese Twitter. You can talk about purely intellectual topics that not many people will necessarily care about. But the minute that you talk about anything that's semi-politically relevant or anything like that, for the most part, only certain viewpoints are allowed to be expressed openly. And if you express other viewpoints, you have to couch them in so much like code language that, frankly, only a small section of the user base will catch on and will understand what the hell is going on. So it's like, which means that the hot topics on Chinese on Weibo in any given day are much more likely going to be about pop culture and things that would not qualify as like high-end political news.
Right.
It's pretty much the same difference between Chinese, like there's a similar difference between Chinese state media and Western media. It has kind of like a similar quality to it. Now that said, like when you talk about things like pop culture or social developments or social news and things like that, or occasionally when a big piece of political news that can't be repressed comes on, it's no less rowdy and it's equally vicious.
That's good. Actually, Taisu, do you have headphones? Because we're getting feedback.
Headphones. It's been quite some time since I've actually used headphones, but let me try to.
Well, that is.
It's fine, Scott. I can just keep Taisu muted when he's not talking, but that just means we have to give a moment between when he talks and when one of us talks.
I got you. Not only is it unpleasant, but it's my voice making. This is really like, it would be one thing if it was somebody else's voice, but it's my own voice tormenting me. Ben, do you want to ask anything about social media? Because actually, I was going to pivot to a different topic. But
yeah, I want to. Before we leave the subject of social media, I want to ask you, what are the and Scott, actually, you should keep yourself muted when you're not talking as well. That'll correct the problem entirely. What are the subjects on social media, like when the things that you can easily say on Twitter that if you say on Chinese social media, it will just disappear or your account will be disciplined? Presumably you can't say, as I did the other day, Taiwan is a country. But how close, what kind of code do you have to speak in order to say what?
Yeah. All right. Great. So the it's gotten much worse in the past 5 years compared to 5 years before. Like 5 years before, there were papers on this done by quantitative scholars. Pretty much all you had to do to stay away from trouble 5 years ago, or perhaps actually not 7 or 8 years ago, was to avoid speaking something that could be seen as like mobilizing mass movement. If you weren't seen as mobilizing collective action on some kind of thing, you could actually discuss political developments and share political gossip and talk about most things, or at least that seemed to be the impression of scholarship. These days, I'd say pretty much any semi-sensitive political topic relating to China is likely going to be under some kind of censorship. So there are things that are completely like you just can't talk about, like like any news relating to Xi Jinping personally that's not authorized by state media, you basically just can't talk about. There are
And what did he do?
Well, for the most part, if you don't do it too often, the first couple of times the post gets just removed. If you do it more than once, more than a couple of times, and you have a record of doing this, they do keep track, and at some point they're going to blow up your account. Like I've had plenty of friends who've lost their accounts this way. Then there are like like right now the major problem is like the precise rules aren't exactly clear, right? So Taiwan you can talk about in certain kinds of ways, because there is a lot of news on Taiwan. On Chinese social media, it's just like you're not quite sure what exactly on Taiwan you can't talk about. Yes, you certainly can't say Taiwan's a country. You probably couldn't speculate about like when if ever China is going to start military action against Taiwan. Although even that has certain exceptions. If you're like going at it from like a hard nationalist point of view, they may not necessarily censor you. Even American politics, which usually is like safe, like I've gone into a habit of like mainly whenever I talk about anything political, I mainly talk about American politics on Chinese Twitter because it's usually safe. Like even that sometimes, like when at a sensitive moment, like during trade negotiations, if I'm like really going after the American government or something like that, that could even be seen as like inconvenient, and they might put a stop to that as well. So the rules change all the time. These days, it's so much more active than it was 7 8 years ago. And I've had plenty of posts that were just basically disappeared into the void. Fortunately, I think the good thing is
How often does that happen?
well, I'm relatively careful on what I say, but nonetheless, it happens to me once every I don't know, like month or so. Like something I say has a sensitive phrase or word, and it just vanishes. Um, at that kind of frequency, I have seen no systemic backlash against my accounts, and it's still active. They still help me advertise and so on and so forth. So apparently the assumption of the censors is that, like, given the range and unpredictability of the censorship, virtually everyone's going to run afoul of the rules at some point. So there's quite a bit of leeway before they blow up your account. Like they have to see regular systemic attempts to express unallowed viewpoints or things like that.
So I'm curious. This is the topic I wanted to talk to you about. And I'm curious about whether you could talk about this on Chinese social media, which is the declaration, if that's what you want to call it, that of the U.S. government that the that what China is doing to the Uyghurs is an act of genocide. So first of all, I'm just curious. Is this discussed? Because it's even in the form of outrage that was been declared, but also like I'm just actually quite curious as to like the enormous complication this is. It just seems like an enormous complication for U.S.-Chinese relations to make that declaration, and I can't imagine how things are going to work when you've already declared that.
Well, so on that specific topic, there's been a weird trajectory of developments over the past couple of months. I think up to about 3 or 4 months ago, you just couldn't talk about it at all. Like the word genocide was blocked for a while. Anything about Xinjiang was basically off limits. I think for a while, like you couldn't even type the word Uyghur without it at least getting like delayed, and somebody had to review it. Then there was a boycott of Xinjiang-produced cotton about like a month or two ago by some Western brands, I think, including I forget the specific brand, but like after that happened, for whatever reason, they decided that it was no longer containable because everyone was talking about it. It was like a popular Western brand that was heavily in use in China as well. And everyone knew about it, everyone talked about it. It was a major social scandal and blow up. So after that, they've actually opened up discussion on Xinjiang. But of course, discussion in the sense that only one possible viewpoint is allowed to be discussed. And that is that is certainly one topic on which, if you have a counter to mainstream viewpoints, if you express it even like 1 or 2 times, I'm pretty sure your account's gonna be dead. So right now they're trying, like they've opened the discussion to the extent that they want to channel public outrage against the U.S. and they're kind of like mobilizing social media as a way to whip up the anger.
So I want to ask about that. Like, I assume what you're allowed to say is some variant of Chinese policy in Xinjiang is modernizing and bringing people into the modern era, and the U.S. is interfering in Chinese affairs and should, get its own house in order. Is that the tenor of what's allowable, or is there a more robust discussion that's tolerated?
Yeah, well, so that's allowable, of course. Like, saying good things about Chinese policy in Xinjiang is certainly allowed. But that's not the mainstream, right? The mainstream opinion actually is like, my God, these Americans are fucking hypocrites. Right, like that seems to be more the mainstream tone of discussion. Like, look at all the stuff that they've done to their indigenous peoples or the minorities in their country. Look at Western imperialism across the globe, so on and so forth. How could they say all this stuff with a straight face and so on? Like, that somehow seems to be more the direction where people are headed to, and the government's happy to see that for some reason. Like, I would have thought before this all started that would have been kind of like an inconvenient position to take, because that would be almost seen as like saying that, like, okay, fine, I did all this stuff, but so what? Like, you did it too. It would seem like an admission of, like, partial admission of guilt before pointing out the hypocrisy. Like, those two things seem to kind of go hand in hand. But the government doesn't seem to see it that way, and so it's happy to play up the hypocrisy attacks. It's not just social media. The Chinese Foreign Ministry is making similar accusations on a pretty regular basis these days. Like, once a week, you see some Foreign Ministry spokesperson call out some version of like Western imperialism, and therefore say that's hypocritical. So surprisingly, that's been the line of attack.
I'm curious about that, though, because China, of course, has its own very substantial history of imperialism, including in a fashion rather similar to American expansionism, which is to say, lots of what is now mainstream China or mainland China used to be inhabited by, and it still is actually inhabited by, people other than Han Chinese, and they have been treated much as indigenous peoples everywhere has been treated. And I assume the Chinese government's way of thinking about that is this thing that you see with respect to their policies toward Tibet and toward other outlying regions, that this is part of China, has always been part of China, and that you sort of deny the imperialism with the sort of blanket assertion that this has always been, always will be, always has been China, or is it more complicated than that in the Chinese government's formulation?
Yeah. It's somewhat more complicated. Like what you just said, like it's always been part of China. Like that's the rhetorical official position. But like you look at the more sophisticated arguments they give out and the more precise way they tend to argue these things in front of an international audience. I think it's quite clear they're aware of and willing to admit that yes, China has expanded from like a small patch of land in the middle of the Yellow River Basin to covering this massive territory, and it's like the Qing conquest of Xinjiang and Tibet is taught in Chinese history textbooks, although with a somewhat different tenor. So like they will if you track the maps of China that you get in like high school textwork or college textbooks, they do show expansionism. They may claim that the expansion happened earlier than some other historians would agree with. They'd say that China first annexed Tibet in like the 9th century instead of in the 18th century, or so on and so forth. But they'll agree that yes, at some point we expanded into Tibet. And they'll readily acknowledge the same thing for Xinjiang. They'll acknowledge there were battles and wars fought over Xinjiang across the various dynasties. It had to be conquered early on, ceded later on, then reconquered, and so on and so forth. So they'll admit to all this history, but which means that I think like their core argument in front of a more sophisticated audience, if they were pressed onto, would be something like, frankly, we haven't done anything that everybody else has done. We've conquered territory in pretty much the same way that Western countries conquered territory. We've treated, as you say, indigenous peoples in pretty much the same way they've always been treated. At the same time, in more modern times, we've boosted living standards, like produced economic growth, and so on and so forth in those regions. So our rule rests upon pretty much the same basis as your rule over the Midwest in the U.S. or the Rockies or the Pacific Midwest. It's like, it's just fiat. And at the same time, we've also done good things for those populations by our standards. And at this point, it's just like no longer practical. So given all...
But isn't that right? I mean, leave aside the question of whether, I mean, lots of places claim that indigenous peoples have benefited and the indigenous peoples in question might beg to differ. But it seems to me the Chinese basis for argument of sovereignty in Xinjiang is actually very similar to the U.S. basis for arguments of sovereignty over, California or I would never say, I don't think that I wouldn't question the legitimacy of the growth of China over the years. I just question the cultural genocide, the ongoing today cultural genocide against Uyghur peoples, the lack of autonomy, the fact that some million of them have been locked up. But it seems to me the oddity is for them to accuse Western governments of hypocrisy while also acknowledging that their growth is that similar and formulated on a fundamentally imperialist model over time.
That's completely right. I think, yes, you could certainly make those arguments coherently. I think the response would be, we can say you're hypocritical, yet at the same time say that we're not necessarily any better than you are. Right? The point of hypocrisy is to say fundamentally we're moral equals on this particular kind of issue. And just shut up. Frankly, if you're Native American, you can maybe accuse us. You would have higher moral ground than to do that. But if you're white descendant of a white settler, then frankly you really have no moral about to stand on. It's not saying, that doesn't amount to saying that whatever according to their point of view, whatever is going on in Xinjiang, we don't admit anything of what's going on in Xinjiang. Regardless of that, on the sovereignty issue and on the treatment of indigenous peoples issues, we're all equally bad. That's a possible position for them to take. That would not be morally satisfying in any truly normative sense, but as a matter of as a diplomatic ploy, you can see the possible effectiveness of that kind of argument. Right? They're not arguing. This is not really a normative argument. This is just kind of a gotcha, shut up kind of argument.
Not to be loud.
You're a football, Scott. Just signal me before you do that.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I'm actually curious, Taisu, whether so for people who don't know, so you grew up in China, but you went to Yale College and your various postgraduate degrees at Yale and in the United States. And so I'm curious so you're an outsider and an insider. So you have this really interesting perspective. And I'm always kind of surprised just because it's anomalous from the people I normally talk to when you talk about China as being we. because obviously that's how you think of it. I'm actually curious as to whether you feel the force of the hypocrisy critique. That is, like, does it emotionally hit you? Like, yeah, because I can imagine you thinking the following thing, and tell me if I'm wrong. You say, like, yeah, I know China is doing a lot of things that I strongly disagree with, and I speak out against, and there's a limit to what I can do, blah, blah, blah. But come on, you guys are pretty bad too in many ways. That is the United States. You're a bunch of hypocrites. I mean, does it hit you emotionally that?
Yeah. So I think like the answer is like kind of to some extent yes, right? So it's possible, and I do feel like this quite often, to both feel moral horror at what's going on in parts of China, and also at the same time feel extreme distaste for the fact that like the UK is lecturing us about imperialism, or the Americans are lecturing us about treatment of indigenous peoples. Like it seems like there are people from whom I would take that kind of thing. The U.S. government and the British government doesn't really quite seem like the right set of people from which to take those kinds of arguments. You could say that you should always treat the idea separately and treat the argument separately from who says it. And yes, as a scholar, you try to do that. But like realistically speaking, when I listen to Chris Patton lecture China about Hong Kong, or lecture China about like not being an imperial power or whatever, I just like the overwhelming hypocrisy is just like disgusting to me, and I feel like that. That doesn't prevent me from feeling like appropriate moral horror and discomfort at other things. But
Okay. Before we move to questions, I was just curious, were you surprised at the Biden administration labeling the Uyghurs as an act of genocide? I mean, because I guess I was pretty surprised, but
I wasn't surprised at all. Like I thought that like I had always expected the Biden administration to do pretty much everything that Trump did against China. This is, as far as I can tell, like China's the one thing that people actually agree on in DC, so they're going to play up that card as harshly as they can. And the genocide thing, like I personally think you can admit the horror of what happened in Xinjiang without necessarily calling it genocide. But regardless, right, like that's become a politically charged issue. It's the way the politics are being played. Of course they're going to play that card. Like they're going to, it's a cheap and easy rhetorical way. The Chinese government, I think is mature enough to like not make that like a fundamental sticking issue in U.S.-China relations. It's not going to really fundamentally change anything. It's just like a thing to say, and it has rhetorical value in American politics. It's something to rally everybody around. Like no rational political actor would pass up that chance. So like I don't think normativity or morality has much to do with that choice. It's just like self-interested rational politics.
So I want to say a word before we go to questions in defense of hypocrisy, because I think I think there's actually something to be said for British and American hypocrisy in this area. No substantial power in the history of the world has ever become so except at somebody else's expense. That's the way substantial powers become substantial powers. They take resources, land, people from other entities. And so to say that having been a power extractor in the past disqualifies you from complaining about behaviors against which the world has turned its face is really to say that we have to be governed by the way people used to behave, and that having acquired power, you can't ever complain about somebody behaving the way that you behaved. And I think that's an argument for, and actually the way the Chinese government is using it is a good example. It's an argument against norms changing. And I would much prefer to see hypocrisy. You know, I would love to see Rome stand up and say, no more conquests of Spain. It's really wrong to have legions. Now, would that be hypocritical? Of course it would. And I think it's great that, Mongolia does not invade Baghdad anymore. And if today modern Mongolia wants to say we're opposed to imperialism, is that hypocritical? Of course it's hypocritical, but it's great. And, I think for the British government to say today, to the extent that we have influence in Hong Kong, which of course they don't in any meaningful sense, but to the extent that our voice is valued at all, here's what we think the rules should be. Is it hypocritical? Of course. But what should they say? Oh, China, do whatever you want in Hong Kong, because, we used to be really assholes in Hong Kong and Singapore. I just think the logical consequence of the complaint about hypocrisy is an argument against moral evolution.
So I think I should be clear. Like, saying somebody's hypocritical for me, is not much of a moral accusation. Like, I'm perfectly happy with saying that you are normatively correct and at the same time you're a fucking hypocrite. Like, those two things can easily coexist with me, especially, frankly, like Scott and I know this all the time because we are on the Yale Law faculty, and you just go to a faculty meeting and this is what happens all the time. Yes, I would have to imagine, given the state of affairs in the world right now, that there cannot be any kind of international advocacy, powerful advocacy of any kind of normative good that is not at least somewhat hypocritical. So I take the point, like hypocrisy is kind of necessary to some extent. You all have to stomach a little bit of like, a certain level of hypocrisy. But so what that means is hypocrisy for me is, again, it's not a normative accusation. It's just like a revulsion. It's just like it's a matter of taste. You can have bad taste, but you can still be right. Now that said, I would say that what the Brits, like the UK position towards Hong Kong goes a bit beyond mere hypocrisy, because they caused a lot of the problems that China had to inherit. So it's like, I create a really shitty scenario that you have to step into, and the guy who steps into that scenario handles it perhaps occasionally poorly, and the guy who left him the shitty scenario now is trying to claim the moral high ground. That to me is beyond mere hypocrisy. Like, that is there's something fundamentally morally wrong with that kind of position, and allowing the UK to indulge itself in its supposed moral superiority down the road actually has negative moral consequences systemically for the world. That's not the same position that the U.S. is with vis-a-vis Xinjiang. So, I would always insist on treating, first of all, Xinjiang and Hong Kong differently, and also, yes, the UK is in a different boat for me than what the U.S. is in.
Interesting. All right, Michael McKenna, you are an orange rectangle, but you should be audible, and the floor is yours.
Hello. My question is, how much of Chinese judicial or legal structure has been adopted from Western European models, and how much is original? How much would someone trained in Western theories of justice and law be comfortable with the analogous Chinese institutions?
Right. So that's an interesting question. I mean, if you look at the form of Chinese legal institutions, what you're going to find are a set of institutions that has pretty much three major influences across its history. The obvious one is the Soviet form of the way that the courts and the prosecutoriate and the police are structured, and so on and so forth. The second one is there's a heavy German Japanese influence on Chinese parts of Chinese civil law and parts of Chinese criminal law. The third is there's a heavy British American influence on various sectors of Chinese commercial law, and so on and so forth. So yeah, the institutions look a lot like what you would see if you merge those three things together into this chimera, which that's formally pretty much what the Chinese legal structure kind of looks like. Functionally, of course, it's completely different, and there are huge amounts of like social carryover. China is perhaps like the single most important and kind of perhaps like most interesting legal transplant story of the 20th century, and it's still ongoing in this regard. It's trying to reclaim the quote-unquote Chineseness of its own institutions. That's not so much of an easy task when so much of your legal elite has been trained in German or American law for the past 20, 30 years. But it's recognizing that there's a certain kind of discomfort for a country that tries to position itself as a new cultural paradigm, as a fully culturally sovereign and ideologically sovereign entity in all dimensions, to have this political legal structure that, institutionally speaking, is basically this grab bag of institutional transplants that were accumulated over the course of the 20th century. Plus the fact that a part of it is Soviet, a part of it is German, a part of it is American, means frankly that the different parts don't always work so well together. It's an ongoing problem. I think, but of course, like on the grounds, the social realities, the actual functionality, the bureaucratic culture, the legal culture, that has a lot of continuities with what happened in China. Like that's historically Chinese, right? Like the form can be easily transplanted, the substance can't. And so the precise balance of like what's domestic and what's transplanted and so on, and so that changes all the time. I'd say that over time it's probably edging towards more kind of like local uniqueness, like domestic uniqueness. The Chinese components, the Chinese substance, the Chinese social characteristics and things like that, they've come to like exert stronger control over how the form functions. And of course, that's inevitable for virtually any kind of like major legal transplant, major system of legal transplants. And of course, in the Chinese case, it's also increasingly less subject to the influences of the international market and so on. And so it's more its own thing, it can impose its own rules. So I'd say, domestic societal path dependency is playing a larger role than it used to, say, 30, 40 years ago. When the structure was much more Soviet than it is now, and compared to 30 years ago, that's when they first brought in all these new Western legal systems again for the second time in the 20th century. Like it's becoming a bit more, let's just say, Chinese in a kind of recognizable social sense these days. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Argyris, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us, Taisu. Can you please comment on China's coercive efforts to control how the PRC and especially Taiwan is characterized in Western mass media entertainment, including Hollywood films? And Ben mentioned this earlier. I'm thinking of actor John Cena's recent apology in Mandarin on China's Weibo for referring to Taiwan as a, quote, country in a Taiwan press event for Fast and Furious 9. And another case I remember is China going after airline websites for sort of characterizing Taiwan and Taipei as like a separate entity on their maps, or sort of being able to book flights, characterizing it separately from mainland China.
Yeah. So of course.
But before you answer that question, I just want to say that the actor in question did not issue the apology that he should have issued, which is an apology for Fast and Furious 9. it seemed to me that really cried out for an apology. I don't mean to change the subject, however.
Yeah, it was called FU.
All right, so I have not seen Fast and Furious 9. I've seen one Fast and Furious movie of the entire franchise. Like I assume based on that I shouldn't waste my time trying to see it. Okay, yeah. So the Taiwan thing is, so let me put this way. The Chinese government doesn't have a ton of red lines for its legitimacy. It's like built up. It's frankly, I think at this point it has a strong enough record and strong enough grip on Chinese society that there are a few like on-off switches that could cause it to automatically lose a huge amount of legitimacy. Taiwan is one of them. So given where Chinese society is nowadays, given where Chinese nationalism is nowadays, if the Chinese government actually allowed this kind of stuff, like, to go unresponded to or like unchallenged in international discourse, the domestic backlash would be immense. Right? This is one of those areas in which like the government's not necessarily in the driver's seat. The government certainly has no interest in diverging from the societal common point of view, but everybody's on board. Like there's no other possibility in Chinese politics than to adamantly refuse to acknowledge the Taiwan as a country, and to lash out at anybody who tries to do that. Like it's, like this would, it's for very complicated and deep reasons, it's just like a red line. It's a red line for the government. It's a red line for pretty much the vast majority of Chinese, like the Chinese population. And so, like what I said about the Biden administration calling Xinjiang a genocide, like it's politically inevitable that was going to happen. Like there is no choice involved here. I don't even think the Chinese government has a choice.
But explain something to me about that, because that confuses me. What is the means by which we know what Chinese public opinion is, given that the government only allows the expression of a very narrow range? And so you describe them as constrained by kind of universal opinion, but do we actually even have a sense of that intensity? And by what means do we?
All right, so there's a difference between the past couple of years when only a very narrow bandwidth of opinions have been allowed to be expressed, and the previous 30 to 40 years, right? So the previous 3.5 decades, there were a wide range of opinions being expressed on Chinese media, and you could certainly get something resembling an accurate opinion poll on major political issues going on in China for a very long time, and many of my friends are specialists in this kind of thing. Even back then, without the recent spike in nationalism, there was clear quantitative and qualitative evidence that for the Chinese population, Taiwan was a red line. I don't think any Chinese government could have survived the populist backlash that would have accompanied actually allowing Taiwan to declare independence. Since then, it's become much harder to actually do quantitative work because of, yes, the censorship and the fear of anyone expressing other ideas. Nonetheless, on certain issues, there's a ton of qualitative evidence. Like, if you follow anecdotally or qualitatively what's been going on in China for the past 5-6 years, you know that nationalism has gone up, not down. I don't need a quantitative survey to tell me that. Like, I know that with nearly 100% accurate certainty. And given that Taiwan was a red line way before this, I am completely sure that it's even more of a red line these days. So, the thing is, China is still not yet a totalitarian society. It's an authoritarian one. And there's a difference between authoritarian societies and totalitarian ones in that in authoritarian societies, there is still enough agency left to the population at various points in time for you to actually be able to have a read of what they think. If you have a systemic totalitarian regime like you have, like the Nazis or something like that, yeah, you can never tell what popular opinion was. China is not like that, and I think that with enough specialization and expertise on certain things, it's possible to tell what the Chinese population actually thinks with reasonable levels of accuracy. And frankly, not everything is politically sensitive either. But of course, Taiwan is. But at least on Taiwan, I'm pretty sure, given the trends and given what we knew 10 years ago, there's no way the Chinese regime these days could survive, allowing Taiwan to become independent. There's just like no way.
Daniel, the floor is yours.
I am wondering what your thoughts are with respect to the economic headwinds and tailwinds China faces over the next couple of years.
All right, that's a really complicated question. Yes, so if you ignore the pandemic and you just go back to 2019, the narrative both inside and outside China was that the Chinese economy was weakening to its probably slowest points in the past 4 decades. The pandemic gave it a bit of a boost in that it basically, because it controlled the pandemic better than virtually anybody else did, and economically recovered much more aggressively, it's given a bit of a boost. But once things have calmed down, like once the pandemic's going to be phasing out over the next year or so, the fundamentals of the Chinese economy have not changed from 2019. Right? Like, there's still a government debt problem. There is still a lack of financial openness problem. The domestic consumption is still a problem. Like aging, demographic aging is still a massive time bomb that's waiting to blow up. So yeah, like China has the same structural challenges that it had before this pandemic changed the narrative. Right? So the proper narrative going forward should still probably be, yes, the Chinese economy is going to face a lot of these massive headwinds, and there's no easy way out. The Chinese government has committed, at least nominally, to making certain kinds of pro-market reforms and pro-openness reforms that would solve some of these problems. So it's trying to address the financing and kind of capital investment problems by opening up its domestic financial market to foreign investment, and to opening up private, to semi-privatizing the financial sector, and allowing state-owned banks to respond more aggressively towards to market forces and so on and so forth. As far as I can tell, it's sincere in saying that it wants to do that. So that might solve some of the problems, but like some of the larger problems, for example, probably the biggest problem is aging. And aging has all kinds of structural distortions on the Chinese economy, both in terms of it depresses consumption, it forces you to save more, it depletes the labor supply, and so on and so forth. Those problems, I think, do not have any foreseeable easy solution. And so if you're what the biggest headwind the Chinese economy faces, it's going to be the structural challenges brought about by an aging population. And that's frankly gotten even worse during the pandemic, because the pandemic was a major negative shock on birth rates as well. So I'd say China got a temporary reprieve because of the pandemic, and it's comparatively better performance during the pandemic than its major competitors. But at the same time, some of the problems that were the fundamental big problems that were plaguing the Chinese economy before 2019 have gotten worse. And while I still think that China has a large enough population, has a large enough possibility of domestic consumption increases to spur economic growth for at least the foreseeable future, I don't believe the economy is going to crash. I think the government has, at this point, worked out a system of control over the economy so that it basically irons out some of the distortions a little bit. Nonetheless, slowing down, I think, is going to be inevitable. I think the government, based on its rhetoric, expects that as well. And the Chinese economic growth slowing to something around 4 to 5% over the next 5-6 years, that's likely, actually, almost certainly going to happen. So, and further beyond that, once demographic aging becomes an even worse problem, I don't think anybody has a clue on what's going to happen, because, frankly, no society has aged this quickly before it hit advanced economy status. So we're kind of flying blind at this point, and making predictions on what might happen in the future is going to be highly difficult just for that reason. But yeah, there's lots of reasons to not be terribly optimistic about what the Chinese economy is going to look like in 10 or 15 years.
Is the assumption in Beijing that the trade barriers will between the United States, the tariffs and various obstacles been placed in the way of Chinese-American trade in the Trump years, whether they will come down or whether animosity is so strong right now in Washington that this is going to continue dragging both countries.
I think the assumption is that it's probably not going to come down anytime soon. So if the American economy were doing significantly worse than it currently is, there might be a reason to expect the barriers coming down because there's too much pain on the U.S. side. With what's going on in the U.S. right now, with pretty strong signs of a good, decent economic recovery this time as compared to 2008. I think the wise assumption in Beijing would have to be that American politicians have enough positive economic momentum to work with, to not necessarily have to be forced into a position where they have to take down the tariffs. And so if that's the case, given the politics of and the optics of taking down tariffs, the smart money would have to be on the tariffs staying there for quite some time. And the thing is, for all Trump's rhetoric, he didn't actually get to the point where he really raised his final batch of doomsday tariffs before he left office. The current tariffs are, yes, they're painful for both sides, but they're not that serious in the broader scheme of things. They haven't risen to the level yet of causing fundamental distortions to the supply chain in either country. So my bet is this current level of tariffs is both politically and economically tolerable on both sides. And whereas the Chinese side would obviously want it to come down, I think if they read things intelligently, which I'm sure they do, they're not going to expect the tariffs to vanish.
Steve Hutton, you get the last in-person question today, though there are a couple that I'm going to read because I can't bring the people in question on screen.
So the Chinese government is currently picking fights with lots of countries. What are the prospects for a less confrontational approach in the future?
So this is a part of Chinese politics where I don't have a clear read on. My hope is that so recently the big thing is the EU is putting a halt on the Sino-EU investment agreement, largely because of backlash over it's EU backlash over China's backlash over EU's responses to Xinjiang. And China took a very aggressive tone and sanctioned a ton of EU officials and scholars and things like that, which played out very poorly in European politics. So now this painstakingly negotiated investment deal that took several years to put together is, as far as anybody can see, dead for the foreseeable future. That's a major, major diplomatic and economic loss for the Chinese side. The hope would be that alerts the Chinese leadership to the costs of their aggressive tone. I think they actually misplayed their cards a little bit because they thought before this incident that the EU was still governed by a bunch of technocratic traditional political elites who cared about the economic payoffs from the investment treaty much more than they cared about any kind of optics over Xinjiang or whatever. I think it turns out that EU politics are more populist than I think the Chinese government was planning for. And the backlash, the popular anger against the Chinese aggression or the Chinese aggressive response to the EU sanctions kind of was much larger and much more politically influential than the Chinese government was hoping for. They were hoping still for traditional technocrat to technocrat interactions between China and the EU. And they're starting to confront the fact that the EU, with a few years lag and delay, is going down the kind of anti-China populist route that you see in the US and in many other parts of the world, like India. So given the fact that China cannot yet afford to lose economic touch and lose significant economic relationships with most of the developed world, I would expect them to tone down the rhetoric. Actually, you've seen the Chinese government tone down its rhetoric towards the U.S. quite a bit over the past year or so, and it's not because Biden's been any friendlier towards China than Trump has been. Like, Biden's been equally aggressive and frankly just as like annoying to China as Trump was, just in a kind of like a slightly lower tone way. But the Chinese government's toned down its aggressiveness towards the U.S. largely because it recognized that just like it had very little to gain and lots of economic things to lose if it actually became too aggressive. I would expect to see a similar dynamic towards the EU over time. Now, the thing is, of course, the US and the EU are different because they're economically strong enough that China is still kind of like symbiotically mutually reliant on them. For other countries that don't have that kind of economic clout, is China going to keep up its more aggressive posture that it's taken in recent years? Well, there's a decent chance of that, but at the same time, you also have to think that if you're a rational bureaucrat in Beijing, you look around and you realize that at this point in time, like, who are our friends and who are our allies? Like, you're starting to recognize that apart from Russia and Iran, you're basically surrounded by either openly hostile regimes like India, or potentially hostile ones like Vietnam, or ones that are politically incompatible with you and have always been kind of like have had a negative relationship with, like that describes Japan and South Korea. And then the U.S. is still in the Asia Pacific militarily and economically, so you're surrounded by adversaries or competitors. Your only reliable significant allies are a military power that's economically becoming increasingly irrelevant, and a Middle Eastern power that frankly just can't really do much for you at all. You have to think that you want more friends, and China really does, and so it's turning up the charm offensive in Africa and parts of Latin America and in Central Asia. I would think that at some point it's gonna realize that you should do more of that and less of the aggressiveness. So I've always thought that it's a wise bet to think of the Chinese bureaucrats as more or less rational actors who care about their own political self-interest and so on and so forth. I really think it is distinctly in China's political self-interest to play a little bit more nicely on the international front, and I would therefore expect that within the next year or two, they hopefully start to do that.
Greg R., I was going to read your question because I couldn't bring you on screen, and no sooner had I said that I couldn't bring you on screen than you popped up. So you get the last question today, and then Scott will wrap us up.
All right, thanks. I think my question sort of maybe fit a little better towards the front of the conversation, but it was kind of a practical question, sort of, may I say, a content moderation question, but how do the social media outfits in China manage verification of identity in terms of how they control it? And then sort of the opposite problem we have here in the United States maybe is that we have a lot of people that are not really people, but entities that are trying to control the conversation. And is there a blue check mark, I guess?
Right. So this is, like one of the fundamental differences between China and the U.S. In terms of personal control over its citizens, China is like qualitatively like several levels ahead of the U.S. It's not even remotely comparable. These days, to go on Chinese social media, any kind of Chinese social media, to buy a phone, you have to register with your government ID. So that pretty much kills it, right? Because like they know who everyone is. If there are bots on the Chinese social media scene, they are bots that are controlled by the government itself. It's a very tightly controlled, internalized system. It's almost like kind of like an Apple versus like PC kind of difference. Like whereas where China's Apple and the U.S. is like Microsoft with the PC. China has a closed system, and in terms of social media, yeah, there's anonymity towards other people. There is no anonymity towards the state. That has helped quite a bit over the course of the pandemic in terms of control of movement and knowing when to shut down and so on and so forth. Yeah, you can also imagine many other parts of everyday life and economic life where that can be a liability to some extent. But this kind of like dominant statist model of control is what we've been building up towards for pretty much like a century at this point. Ever since the 1920s, China's fundamental paradigm has been trying to like build up its state and give the state more control, not less. And I would not expect this to change anytime soon. Like frankly, even if China at some point becomes like takes its foot off the pedal in terms of how much it controls, in terms of how much it kind of like shuts things down, the technical level of potential control the government has over society, I don't think it's going to go down anytime soon.
Can I go, Ben?
Voila, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Taisu. That this was like an incredible download, it's amazing that one person can tell us what 1 billion people are thinking. So I wrote. That was a joke. I invite you on as our mystery guest, and then I say something stupid like that. I'm really sorry. But I just want to say, we will be back. Can I do this? Can I do this? Hold on. Okay.
Please.
We will be back in 22 hours and 56 minutes. But until then, we can't have fun anymore. But Ben?
But we can have a hypocrisy in our evaluation of Chinese policy. And we can even do it in a relatively unapologetic sort of way. So,